Alright, what I'm about to do is called a bad idea. I'm going to talk about Ralsei in Deltarune Chapter 2. Look, let's just start with what we all know. Ralsei is sus. We're not going to talk about why yet. We all agree on that, right? Ralsei is sus. Okay. The reason I'm making this video is that the community has kind of started pushing this perspective on how to interpret what's going on with Ralsei that I think is going in the wrong direction, but at the same time, I kind of can't blame them for thinking this. Basically, a lot of people are now claiming that the whole idea that Asriel and Ralsei are the same person has been debunked. And I think that the evidence is quite weak for that. Before I say any more, I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to argue that Asriel is literally running back from college over to his old hometown to go play with Chris and Susie only when they go into the dark world all of a sudden. I think that is obviously way too far-fetched and something I don't think anyone really believed except at the start of Chapter 1 before they finished it. But I think it's basically undeniable that Ralsei has to, at the very least, be a representation of Asriel in some form, and kind of what I'm going with most, even though I am open to other variations of this interpretation, is I think it's most likely that Ralsei is a representation of Chris's childhood memories of Asriel, which is strange, but I also kind of buy into it and think it's the second most likely outcome, which is that Asriel is Ralsei, and essentially they never went to college and they actually hid away in the dark world. Now, both of these statements have a lot of things behind them that I would have to bring up, so we're going to take this a bit at a time now. I'm going to slow down and I'm going to start explaining myself. So let's look at the evidence that supposedly debunks the idea that Ralsei is Asriel. It's 2 points. The first one being that Ralsei is a Darkner. If he lives in the dark world, then how could he exist in the light world as Asriel? Yes, the Lightners can come into the dark world and they're still Lightners, but the Darkners haven't been able to come into the light world without being turned into objects. My counterpoint would be 2 parts. One, for the first theory that Ralsei is a representation of Chris's childhood memories of Asriel, them being a Darkner wouldn't debunk that theory. The second theory that Ralsei might literally be Asriel hiding away in the dark worlds and actually not being at college, that would actually also make sense because we haven't seen what Ralsei turns into when they go from the dark world to the light world, unless they themselves are a Lightner. How do we know that they're a Darkner? They said they're a Darkner. We only see them in the dark world, but Lightners can go into the dark world, so if he hadn't left the dark world, then that would make sense. And it would also explain how he got to the library. I know that then brings up the question of how would no one have spotted him on the way there if he did have to come into the light world to reach the library, but this is another thing I find kind of interesting. What was the point of Ralsei disguising themselves in Chapter 1? First of all with the hoodie, but then second of all obviously with the fact that they had black fur and all that, and then they only revealed themselves to be Asriel at the end. If Ralsei came into the light world quite literally wearing the black fur kind of costume thing, then no one would recognize them as Asriel if they are Asriel. But okay, let's get to the main point, and I kind of hate to bring it up because this is where we get less into evidence and more into, ooh, would Toby do that? Because, this is why I feel like I had to make this video, because I feel like this is going to create some really weird discussion otherwise. Basically, there seems to be an implication of romance between Chris and Ralsei. Now, that's been true for a decent amount of characters, but this is especially strange because although it was kind of there in Chapter 1, in Chapter 1 I could genuinely buy that it was just Ralsei being Ralsei, but with Chapter 2 with the swan ride and all that, it really looks like they're trying to push at least an ambiguity about whether they would be into each other or not, and that would obviously be weird if, you know, they're brothers. So as much as I don't like to say it, my counterpoint to this is, does that mean it can't happen? I'm not saying whether it should happen or not, but does that mean Toby won't do it? Now, I know that the majority of you are probably thinking, of course Toby wouldn't do that, but here's the thing, this is where it kind of becomes a bit more grey. Chris and Ralsei aren't blood related, because Chris is adopted. Technically I'm just guessing that, but I mean, considering they are a human and their parents are monsters, I don't think that that's how that works in Deltarune. I think he must be adopted. And considering they aren't blood related, honestly, I could see Toby maybe doing that. definitely a risky move, but at the same time, I mean, there's very clear, LGBT representation and all that. And I'm not trying to say that is the same as this, but of course the main thing that would be creepy about this whole situation is if they were blood related. So while that seems very strange, I don't think that this very weak point alone is enough to say that Ralsei is not Asriel. I just feel like I really have to address this because as much as I kind of feel uncomfortable about talking about this subject, at the same time, I feel like it's going to push the theory-making discourse in this community in a very negative direction, where people are extremely dismissive of a whole bunch of theories just because they don't want to think that, well, have a guess. So now that I've explained how this is actually very weak evidence for Ralsei and Asriel not being the same person, let me just put this in perspective for people who aren't quite as updated on the kind of theories around Deltarune, and show you all the evidence that they are the same person. And I am definitely going to miss some, but well, let's just start with the obvious, that their name is literally an anagram of Asriel. There's the fact that they look like Asriel, exactly like him. Again, there's the fact I mentioned before that we can't actually trust Ralsei when he says he's a Darkner, and he very much could be a Lightner, which would also explain another reason lots of people are sus of him, and that was of course the fact that he explains that Lancer turned to a statue in Queen's Dark World because they didn't belong in that world. However, Ralsei didn't belong in that world, and they didn't turn into a statue. Now, of course, that could be something to do with his fountain. He mentions that his fountain is made of pure darkness, and apparently that means that any Darkner can live in his dark world, his castle town. But even that is never really explained, and we're kind of making assumptions there. Personally, between these two theories, that Ralsei is either a Darkner that represents Chris's childhood memories of Asriel, or a Lightner hiding in the dark world, both of them seem very, very likely to me, but I wouldn't know which one to go with as of right now. Another thing which makes this extra confusing is a detail that I noticed that I haven't really seen anyone talking about, which has really piqued my interest. Back in Deltarune Chapter 1, we didn't really see many Undertale ideas or mechanics coming back. Even determination wasn't mentioned by name, even though it was implied. And I was even thinking for a bit, maybe these things just don't even exist in Deltarune, maybe we are being tricked. After all, especially Chapter 1 was all about subverting our expectations, and so it makes sense to me if we were expecting that the save points were working through determination, that it wouldn't be too far-fetched to think that they were working through some other means. That means that Toby could keep a secret and then actually have as a surprise twist, even if it was technically obvious, because all the fans would get tunnel-visioned into thinking it would be determination. Now, before I go any further, I should say that I'm not arguing that determination is not a thing in Deltarune, but I'm just pointing out that back in Chapter 1, a lot of these things, we couldn't necessarily assume they worked the same way they did in the past. This is going to be important for what I'm about to say. We've seen souls kind of have a bit of a resurgence in Chapter 2 in importance, with the fact that, well, Spamton is the only enemy in the entire game that wants your soul. And that's kind of interesting, because it goes over your head as an Undertale player the first time you fight him, because you're so used to that being the reason everyone fights you in Undertale. But in Deltarune, no one's fighting you to take your soul, except Spamton. But then that made me think of something else. Monsters have souls too, don't they? We saw monster souls in Undertale, it was just that they were weaker than human souls, but they still existed. Where are the monster souls in this game? We never see the soul of any single monster in the game. And while simply not seeing them could just be a coincidence, I mean, why would we have seen one? This, I don't think, is a coincidence. Who is the only person who can seal the fountains? It's Chris. And why is that? Because he seals them with his soul. If Susie had a soul, then surely they could use their soul to seal the fountain, but they never do. Now, it could just be that monster souls are too weak to seal the fountain, but it almost feels like it's on purpose that Toby is trying to avoid letting us see monster souls in Deltarune at every opportunity. What I'm saying is, we have to consider the possibility even that monsters do not have souls in the Deltarune world, even though they did in the Undertale world. Or at least possibly not in the same way. What's the point of me saying all this? How does this relate back to Ralsei? Well, again, the whole theory that they could be a Lightner, this works with that too. If monsters don't have souls, then you couldn't say that the idea that Ralsei is a Lightner could be debunked by the fact he isn't shown to have a soul so far. Because if he was a Lightner and a monster, Even if he was a Lightner, he would still not have a soul. So anyway, before I go any deeper into this rabbit hole and make this video way too long, I think I need to talk about the second big thing that I want to cover in this video. Well, we can all agree that Ralsei is sus. Can we agree that he's probably not the bad guy? I'm not gonna say it's impossible, but I kind of cringe a little seeing these Ralsei is the secret villain theories. I don't know, I don't want to, put him down too much, because I don't think it's impossible, but I don't see Ralsei being the straight up villain of Deltarune. Do I think that he is withholding information from us and lying to us? Absolutely. But when you look at the story as a whole, it doesn't actually make sense for Ralsei to be trying to betray you. You see, when I was thinking about this theory about Ralsei being the villain, when I was first watching Deltarune Chapter 2, it all seemed to fit together, and it was all pointing in one direction. This theory would work really well if what Ralsei wanted was for there to be more fountains. Obviously, he clearly likes being around Susie and Chris, and the more fountains they are, the more dark worlds they have to go into with Ralsei and have all these fun adventures. As well as that, if the theory that I proposed that Asriel and Ralsei are the same person, and Asriel is hiding in the dark world to hide away from the real world, potentially for some real life problems that he doesn't want to deal with, and instead wants to go away into this dark world where he can have fun with his friends, then yeah, this looks like it all lines up really nicely to this idea of Ralsei being the big villain who is unhealthily creating all these dark worlds for him to escape into to not have to face his real life problems. It all makes a lot of sense until the ending of Chapter 2, where everyone wants to do that and Ralsei is the only one who stops everyone from doing that by telling them about the roaring. Now, to be fair, can we believe him on the story about the roaring? We don't know. It always seems like he's the only one that knows about all these prophecies and all that. But at the very least, it shows that it no longer makes sense for his motive to be that he wants more dark worlds. He does want to get rid of them. So while it seems at first a little bit weak that I've just debunked one possible motivation for Ralsei being the villain, can anyone think of another one? What other thing would Ralsei get out of betraying the player? What I think is going on is that Ralsei does not want to betray the player, but maybe they want to quote-unquote betray Chris. We've made it very clear that there is a distinction between you, the player, and Chris, the person you're controlling in Deltarune. And I mean, at the end of the day, Ralsei said he wants to seal these dark fountains. Chris is the one making these dark fountains when the player loses control of them, and the player is the one sealing them. Why would Ralsei want to betray the player makes no sense, but why Ralsei might want to betray Chris makes a bit more sense. If Ralsei does in fact know that Chris is the knight, which there's a decent chance he does, honestly. First of all, just because of the fact that he seems to know a lot of stuff that no one else knows, especially to do with dark worlds and fountains and all that. But also, second of all, because whether he's a representation of Asriel or literally Asriel, I feel like Ralsei would definitely know Chris very well. And Ralsei probably knows that Chris would have this kind of unhealthy need to keep relying on these dark worlds as an escape from their own life. So that leaves just about one argument left as to why Ralsei is the villain, and that would be that the dark worlds are a good thing and Ralsei is destroying them for evil reasons. Now, I won't say this theory has no merit. Of course, Ralsei has his own dark fountain, and he never suggests sealing that one. And then from there, you can of course frame this in a pretty nasty way. Maybe Ralsei just wants everyone to live under his rule, just like the king said. If every single Darkner from every single dark world only had his world to live in, then of course that would kind of be a power-hungry thing to do, and a pretty manipulative thing to do to get Chris and Susie to get everyone into his castle town so he could rule over all darkness. But then, what then? Like, what horrible thing is he going to do with that? You see, this is why I will say I don't think the theory is fully debunked, because I will admit, it could just be something completely out of left field we couldn't have seen coming. Maybe he does want to bring on the roaring, but then that seems a bit far-fetched. Like, there are points you can make that don't not make sense, but like, they just seem very out there, based off of a lot of assumptions, and just kind of, it could be this. And all this nasty sounding stuff suddenly makes a lot more sense and doesn't sound quite so bad when you realise that Ralsei said his dark fountain is made of quote-unquote pure darkness, and this means that anyone can live in his town. So I think I need to talk about what dark worlds most likely represent in Deltarune, and I'm going to speak in vague terms, but I think it's literally impossible for me to talk about these without making stupid assumptions unless I speak about them vaguely, because I don't think there's a very easy way that I can literally pin down exactly what a dark world is a metaphor for. But generally, they are obviously kind of a metaphor for this kind of need for escapist fantasy to comfort us from the hardship of life and all that. It would explain why Ralsei talks so much about the balance of light and dark, rather than, oh, the light defeats the dark or the dark defeats the light. It would explain why he talks so much about darkness and lightness needing each other and being happiest when they help each other. Darkness are a product of lightness kind of fantasies and, their thoughts and hopes given form, in a way. And when you look at it that way, it makes a lot of sense. If lightness did not have darkness, and darkness quite literally represent their, hopes and dreams and their kind of fantasies, then, yeah, they probably wouldn't have much reason to be happy or to look forward to anything in life. But then if they only lived through their fantasies, then they wouldn't live their life, and they would be irresponsible and not take control of their life and allow things to fall into chaos. Now, this is a bit of a weird angle because it gets kind of pseudo-political, but now think of these fantasies as people's worldviews. Because I think the bottom line here is, my guess at the moment is that these dark worlds are kind of, and the idea of Ralsei bringing all the darkness from other dark worlds into his own dark world where anyone can live, is a message about inclusivity. Maybe that sounds a little sappy, but this is the dev of Undertale we're talking about. Fountains are formed and shaped by the determination and the will of their creator. And if the will of its creator doesn't allow all darkness to flourish in that world, and instead leaves sun to just turn to statues and, well, basically do their version of die, then you could say that's not very inclusive. I could genuinely believe that all that Ralsei wants to do is bring all these darkness into a place where they can all coexist. It does raise the question, though, of who created Ralsei's fountain, which is one that I'm not going to address right now because I think we basically have no evidence to say anything about that, but I do want to say I think that's going to be important later. Sure, it could just be Chris, but all the fountains Chris has created so far haven't allowed all darkness to live in them. Why is this one so special unless Chris didn't make it? Maybe, even potentially, Ralsei made it. Again, if we go with the idea that Ralsei is Asriel hiding in the dark world, then he would be capable of doing that. At least it's implied. Because although monsters couldn't really have determination without melting in Undertale, the Queen does mention about trying to draw out Noelle's determination so that she could create a fountain herself when obviously Noelle is a monster. And it's possible that the Queen is just misinformed, but honestly, that would seem like a weird direction for Toby to go, especially without showing any reason why she would be misinformed. So I guess monsters could have determination in Deltarune, at least it seems. And if they could, then yes, Asriel could have created a fountain. And that could be the fountain that we see in Ralsei's castle town. And before I go any further on this tangent, I want to also bring it back to the whole point of maybe the dark worlds are a good thing, and point out how tone-deaf it would seem if that were true. First of all, there's of course the fact that we still kind of are considering whether Chris is literally Kara or not, and I mean, if they are, then they would be very clearly an antagonist, and then they are also the one creating the fountains, so already that would kind of frame that as a bad thing. And it feels like the whole message of the game is supposed to be about this balance between our kind of fantasies and our ideals and our actual real lives, the whole balance between light and dark, with the lightness and darkness and the dark worlds and the real world. It would seem so tone deaf to me to then make it so, oh yeah, this person who's just making a whole bunch of fantasy dark worlds that for people to live in to escape their problems, yeah, they're the real hero, Ralsei, they're the real villain. I kind of hate to put it like this because it sounds like I'm just insulting people who made this theory, but at the same time, I do think you have to look at, if this was the case, does it look like it makes sense from a storytelling perspective? And it just doesn't, does it? I just can't see an angle where Ralsei is the villain where it makes sense. I don't think that Toby is above making Ralsei a twist villain, but I don't think any of the angles we have right now would be ways that are believable for his character for him to go, or ways that would make sense in terms of the kind of overall message the game is delivering. So what do I think Ralsei's plan is? Well, I don't know exactly, but as I've mentioned before, I think Ralsei is working with the player but against Chris. Chris is the one creating the fountains, the player is the one sealing them. Whether Ralsei literally knows whether it's Chris or not, I'm not sure, but I think that it's certainly a very valid possibility. So let me stop and support this claim a little bit. One of the big things that kind of contributes to the idea that Ralsei is an antagonist is how suspicious he acts with the Spamton fight, trying to say that it didn't mean anything. Now, of course, he is lying here. Clearly it meant something, and clearly he seems to know what it was, and he doesn't want Chris and Susie to know. But here's the thing. What was Spamton's fight all about? Well, we know, don't we? Or at least if you have been following the theories, Spamton wanted to achieve freedom because he didn't believe he had free will in the dark world, and somehow he thought that getting powerful enough or big enough would allow him to see past the dark, quote-unquote, and break his own strings. Now, we don't know exactly why he thought simply getting big enough or strong enough would be what allowed him to break free, but it's assumed it's something to do with LV, since that's what hyperlinked blocked is, as we found out in the Snowgrave route in the Spamton Neo fight there. If what Spamton is trying to tell Chris is, hey, you don't have control of your own body, why don't you do what I do and go around killing people to take their souls so that you can get strong enough to make your own damn decisions, you could kind of understand why Ralsei might not want Chris to hear that, especially considering with what we know about Chris, they could very well agree with that idea. Now, I'm not going to say that that is the absolute perfect thing to do. There is no real right answer here. It's obviously a bit mean to Chris to pretend that it didn't mean anything when it clearly did, but at the same time, if Ralsei does say to Chris, yes, that was very strange, I know, let me tell you what that all meant, well, either Chris is going to freak out, or if they already knew this, maybe then that's the point where they decide, you know what, right, fine, I'm not dealing with this anymore, rips out the heart for good, and maybe then just goes creating as many fountains as he damn wants, and obviously then brings on the roaring. Another thing that I also find really interesting is Ralsei in Snowgrave. Now, Ralsei doesn't seem to have any idea what we've been up to in Snowgrave, and that kind of surprises me a little bit. I was kind of expecting him to, at the very least, start getting suspicious, maybe not directly confront us, but start to think, maybe something's up here. But he doesn't seem to have any suspicions about what you're doing, which seems strange. It feels very much like Ralsei should clock onto it. Unless Ralsei has already put their trust in the player and knows the player is in control of Chris, and they believe that the player wouldn't do that. Now, I know that that sounds like a bit of a stretch, but I do have a little bit of evidence for this. As we've seen in both Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, there's moments where Susie goes off on her own and we switch perspective to her, but before that happens, Ralsei asks Chris if they're worried about Susie, and then to think about them, and kind of forces them to do it even. And then we go to controlling or at least watching Susie. Now, this is interesting because the first time it might have just seemed like a strange decision from Toby, but the second time it definitely feels like it was done on purpose. So most people can agree at this point that when Ralsei's doing this, they're very much aware the player is there, and they're very much aware that by doing this, they can get the player to switch their perspective over to Susie and watch what she's doing instead. And this has been used as part of the Ralsei as a villain theory, because then Ralsei uses that to talk to Chris without the player seeing what he's talking about, and then he says, the last thing we hear him say when we come back to him is, and that's why, Chris. And I believe that's both times as well. And sure, that seems sinister, that he wants the player to look away and then not see what he's talking about. But the thing is, we also kind of know that whatever Ralsei's talking about, Chris doesn't like it. Look up T-Theory if you don't know what I'm on about, but basically there's a lot of reasons why people are pretty sure that Chris does not like Ralsei. And the only reason he could really have for that, unless it's just simply, again, maybe he doesn't like seeing someone that clearly represents his brother for whatever reason. But another thing that a lot of people agree on is that maybe he doesn't like whatever Ralsei has told him in this moment. But here's the thing, if Chris is the one creating the fountains and not us, then the fact that he finds it uncomfortable, whatever Ralsei is saying, or he doesn't like it, it kind of implies that he's telling him why they have to seal the fountains, or something like that. But what it gets really interesting is when he tries to do it in Snowgrave. And I absolutely loved this moment because even though I'm glad to see that most people agree it's probably on purpose now, when I was first thinking this might be happening on purpose, I was thinking I was being too paranoid. Because I had a few times I was really paranoid and like very innocuous lines. I thought, wait, does that mean this character's gonna do this? But this line basically flat out confirmed Ralsei knows what he's doing when the Susie bits happen. In Snowgrave, when he tries to do it, he doesn't just say, oh, aren't you worried about Susie? Don't you wonder what she's up to? Why don't we think about her? When that doesn't work, when you don't even get the option to respond, he then tries to say it again. He's like, don't you think we should worry about... He's really on the nose about it then. And then afterwards, he just seems a bit confused. He's like, you're right, it's only been a minute. And just goes back to acting normally. I think in that moment, he was fully expecting the player to then change their perspective to Susie. But in this route, the player has chosen that they don't really care about anyone there. They care about getting stronger. So of course, the player wouldn't then move their perspective over to Susie because they don't care what's happening there. But Ralsei's not clocked on to this yet because, well, it seems like he has a positive assumption about the player, considering he doesn't instantly become suspicious of them, having left them for ages, having, you know, killed Birdley and all these NPCs. Yes, he didn't see that, but obviously there are reasons that he could have kind of gotten a sense something was wrong. Obviously the fact that you come back to the castle town with, you know, no new recruits. At least that's my thoughts about what's going on with Ralsei, but again, I think that we obviously can't say at this point. It's something that is going to continue to be up to interpretation, most likely for a long time, until closer to the end of Deltarune's development, when it will probably become a lot more potentially solid. All I want to do really with this video is, besides just get out my own opinion on it, is just generally try to push to have a bit more open-mindedness with theories, because it seems like recently a lot of people have started to say that generally accepted theories in the past are now just, no, we're not going to accept those anymore. And I'd understand if there was straight up like solid debunking of these theories, but the evidence to debunk these theories is quite weak a lot of the time. And not even all of them are ones that I necessarily agree with, but even still, I think you do have to continue to consider all possibilities. Like, even the theories that I've really gone against in this video, I have not said they're impossible, and I still think about, well, if that were the case, how would that work? Even the Ralsei is a villain one, which I really don't think that's going to be the case. At the same time, if he is lying about all the prophecies we've seen, considering, again, he seems to be the only one who knows about them, then it would actually make sense. Or I could see, maybe he doesn't even realize this is going to happen, but I could see it being something like when you get to the end of the game and you've recruited everyone, just having everyone in that one dark world, even though there aren't necessarily multiple fountains, is enough darkness to bring on the roaring, something like that. Again, I don't think it's impossible for something like that to happen, but it just seems like when you look at it that way, it seems like it's all way too far-fetched. But again, you never know with Toby. Next chapter, we could get a sudden dump of information that could come out of nowhere and suddenly flip everything we thought we knew about Ralsei on its head, and then maybe the villain theory will look a whole lot more convincing. I guess I'll end this out on, I mentioned before, the two main things that I think are possible for what Ralsei is that, again, they are either literally Asriel hiding away from the dark world, hiding away from their real life, or they are a representation of Chris's childhood memories of Ralsei. Now, I haven't really defended that second one so much in this video. I've mostly talked about the first one, but that's just because the first one's a lot more interesting, and it does actually explain a decent amount, although I'm a little bit unsure if that is actually it, considering Ralsei, of course, seems to talk so much about not letting there be too much darkness, having a balance of dark and light, and preventing people from creating too many dark worlds. It would seem that it would be hypocritical of him to be doing that if he is literally Asriel hiding away from his real life by hiding in the dark world. But at the same time, I could see it potentially being a kind of don't make the same mistake I did kind of angle. But anyway, I'm just saying that the reason why I hold both of these theories in equal regard, even though I've presented a lot more evidence for the Ralsei is literally Asriel theory, is because although the Ralsei is literally Asriel theory feels like it has a lot of evidence behind it, at the same time it has some more thematic problems behind it, like I've already mentioned. And there are some things that make a little bit more sense with the other theory too, that he's literally just a representation of the memories of Asriel, because, well, one thing I noticed is that Ralsei seems to be relatively young, or at least he appears that way. He's shorter than Chris. And that would be surprising if Asriel is the older brother Obviously, it's not impossible for Asriel to be shorter than Chris, even if he is the older brother, but, you know, you kind of expect him to be taller. Anyway, I don't have a good way to end this video. This is all unscripted, just with the really bad stammering and stuttering all cut out. Hopefully it wasn't too bad. This video was a mistake, but it's one that I had to make.